So we're in Acts chapter 17, and I'm going to read from verse 18. Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him. And some said, "What will this babbler say?" Others some, "He seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new doctrine, whereof thou speakest, is. For thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know therefore what these things mean. For all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God, him therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worship with men's hands, as though he needeth anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he is not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. I'm going to give a tiny little bit of review for those who might have missed a little bit of review. Paul is in Athens. Paul has had to leave the previous location in Berea in a bit of a hurry, having been persecuted out of the place. And Athens is an interesting place. Now, Athens never became a huge city, unlike Rome. Rome was the first city in the world to get to 1 million people. It's a lot of people. And that was in the New Testament times. It got to be around that figure. Ephesus apparently got to be a very large city. And Athens was relatively small, measuring in the tens of thousands.1 if you go to Athens today, it's now 5 million. And it's just, if you go up on the Acropolis, the height, there are probably two high spots in Athens, and you can see the city just going all the way around, all the way to the sea, to the south, everywhere, just concrete buildings and so on. So a vast metropolis, probably almost the population of Ireland concentrated there. But back in those days, it was a lot smaller, but it was the focal point of the various philosophers and so on. It was the center of Gnostic thinking. It was the home of several Greek Gnostic philosophers. You've heard of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Epicurus. Well, they were all around the centuries before Christ. And there's a guy called Pythagoras. Now, most of you will have heard of Pythagoras. Anybody? Okay, you hear about it in school. The theorem of Pythagoras. Well, he was involved in a lot of stuff, including mathematics. He taught the transmission or transmigration of souls, which is the idea that, within you have a soul, it's immortal, and then upon death it enters into a new body. Now, all of these philosophers were Gnostics, which comes from the word gnosko, to know. They said they felt they knew something, an inside track. And of course, what they were putting forth was the lie of the devil, the lie of the garden, What was the lie of the garden to Eve? To entice her to eat of the forbidden fruit. What was the lie? The lie was, "You shall be as gods." You will know some of this tremendous experience. It says, "You shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." And that's where Gnostic teaching comes from. The idea that you can develop and progress up a kind of a ladder. The Greeks had a word for it. They called it the pleroma, and you would gather up. And so when the Apostle Paul talked about the resurrection of the body, they were absolutely appalled because they viewed this body as a prison, something to be got out of. Flesh is evil, and the body is a place, it's a prison of pain and suffering in their viewpoint. And so they would celebrate not so much the day of your birth. In fact, your day of your birth is a bad occasion, a sorrowful occasion, because it means you're stuck in flesh. And they would celebrate instead the day of your death. They saw it as a liberation from a body and a progression, hopefully, in their view, upwards, if you've been good in that body and lived righteously or whatever. But of course, Christianity cuts across that totally. The body is not a curse. The body is cursed because of sin, but that curse is going to be reversed. This body is important. And that's why Christians should seek not to destroy the body after death in cremation, but preserve it as best as possible. Of course, if the Lord would come back, a few days after your death, your body would be in pretty good shape. Not great, but in pretty good shape. But give it 100 years, it will have degraded somewhat. So, verse 18, certain philosophers of the Epicureans and the Stoics. Now, Epicureanism came after, or is founded by a guy called Epicurus. And his philosophy was hedonism, which means pleasure seeking. Eat, drink, have pleasure, because tomorrow you die. Grab all you can of the pleasures of life, because life's going to be over soon, and you can do what you like as long as it's pleasurable. It's a devotion to pleasure, comfort, high living. Well, that is today's philosophy. To seek after pleasure, and to the exclusion of course, of the true God. And then there's the Stoics. Stoicism is the idea that you would deny fleshly pleasures, and that denial will lead you to a better place in the afterlife. And we can see these ideas in our society today. The pleasure-seeking aspect, the reasoning that the body doesn't matter, salvation is spiritual, therefore what you do with the body doesn't matter, just indulge it. On one hand, that was one group, the Epicureans. The Stoics were saying, no, flesh is bad, and getting into enjoyment of fleshly things just ties you down more to it, and so on. Flesh is evil. We get the idea of vegetarianism develops from that, and so forth. So, when they heard him talking, it's verse 18, Jesus and the resurrection, they said, he seems to be a setter forth of strange gods. Now, the word for gods there in verse 18 is daimonion, demons. And the Bible tells us, if you go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and by the way, the ancient world was full of idolatry. Mind you, you don't have to go to the ancient world, you go to certain parts of the world. In fact, you don't have to go very far from here, and idolatry is alive and well in certain religious circles, statues, people lighting candles in front of statues and using them in worship. That's all error. But you go to some parts of the world and it's rife. We were in Burma, quite a few years ago now, and we went to the main temple in the capital city. massive complex, and it's full of idols, statues, and people bowing down before them and bringing sacrifices and so forth. So, 1 Corinthians 10:20, what do we read there? But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils, demons. So there are religions that are founded by demons, people are held captive by demons, fallen angels. So when Paul is preaching Jesus, well, they identify him as a god, and even the resurrection they erroneously think is a god. Okay, so they bring him to this place called Areopagus. Now, I mentioned last time this place, one of the great painters, I think he's called Raphael. You might have heard of him, and Leonardo, and all these people. He was a great painter. And if you look at his works, they are amazing. And he painted some pictures of what he thought Athens looked like and what he thought Areopagus, which is Mars Hill. So if you can picture, Athens is on a fairly kind of a level place, and then there's this big plateau, a bit like Ben Bulben up in County Sligo, if you know it. It's a plateau, a hill with a flat top, like a table mountain. And on top of that is built a whole bunch of temples to different gods. Okay? Well, on the way up there, there's a hill, and it's called Mars Hill. It has a connection with Mars, the god of war, and certain things are supposed to have happened there. Well, Raphael has a painting of Paul preaching to the men of Athens, and he'd never been there, obviously. And it looks nothing like that rosy picture that is portrayed by the artist. He's the same one who portrays Jesus with long hair. Jesus didn't have long hair. The same kind of people who portray the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch in the desert wearing furs. In the desert, well, at night time you might need them, but not during the day. So these people hadn't a clue. But you go to this place, and maybe it was a lot more ornate in those days. It's where the wise men of Athens hung out, and they, if you read in verse 21, it says, all the Athenians and strangers that were there. So this is a place where they gathered. Obviously, there was a period of prosperity in the nation at that point. They weren't just subsisting, surviving. There was enough spare money for these guys to hang around all day chatting and discussing. So it says they spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. There are people like that out there as well. You know, they're always interested in hearing about some new religion. The Bible warns us about people having itching ears. In other words, they want their ears to be tickled and to hear something that is attractive to their hearing. They like the idea. It doesn't jar with them. And from time to time, we've had people come to church here, and they sit in the congregation, and they say, "No, I'm not coming here anymore. I don't want to hear about this kind of a God who's going to judge sin." And they want to go, and they go off somewhere else where they hear a more ear-tickling message, something that's more attractive, and it means that they can actually wallow in their sin without being challenged and being made uncomfortable and being told that, one day that sin is going to catch up with you and you're going to be judged by a holy and righteous God. That is not a popular message, and therefore they want to go somewhere else. And we've seen this happen. In fact, somebody said something more or less this week to me on the phone. My God is not going to turn anybody away. Kind of God. The problem is, there's only one true God. There's only one God we have to deal with, and He has revealed Himself here. My authority for what I say is in here. So what are these other people's authority? None. It's a God of their own imagination. A God as they conceive him to be. The problem is, when that hits the hard reality of the true God at the day of judgment, they won't have a leg to stand on. Will they? No. So, we have here, they bring him to Areopagus, and a tremendous gospel opportunity. May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is. Verse 19. Fairly unassuming place today. Might have been a lot more attractive then. Maybe all the nice paving stones, etc., had been stolen off for somewhere else. So, verse 20. For thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know therefore what these things mean. Now, I'm sad to reveal that their interest was not one of driving conviction to find the truth. Oh, it's so wonderful to find prepared hearts, people who are searching for truth. But many people are just want to, oh, that's very interesting. I'll just put that on the shelf as another little interesting doctrine that I can admire, but I don't want to get too involved in it. I don't want to get too much into it. So, verse 22, then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill. So the time we were up there, it was a gale force wind. In fact, you could hardly stand up. It was so strong it'd blow you over. I think somebody did get blown over. You had to be very careful. But he stood up there. He said, "Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious." Now, the word here actually has the word demon in it. And it's a compound word. It means literally fear of demons. You see, people throughout the world are in bondage to fear of demons. And so you find some tribe out in some part of Papua New Guinea, and they're offering sacrifices because they feel if they don't, then the gods who give a good harvest will be displeased with them and will not give them a good harvest this year. That kind of thing. And you go out to the other end of the world, you go to Mexico. And there was a great empire rose up there, fabulously rich, gold. And the Spaniards set their sights on it. But people were not living happily there before the Spaniards came. Spaniards didn't bring a lot of happiness either, but they were not living happily. In fact, that empire went to war, and one of the main purposes of going to war was not so much to take extra territory, which of course is a big motivation. It was to take prisoners for their sacrifices. They would take their prisoners, and they have depicted this on their artwork in their temples. And they would tie the prisoners down, and I won't go into too much detail, but they would offer them as sacrifices. They would kill them, cut their heart out while they're yet beating in their chests as an offering to their gods, to appease their gods. They're worshipping demons. Demons are wicked and evil. And no wonder they looked for human sacrifice. All over the world. It happened in Ireland, it happened in Africa. Maybe still happening in places. So people are in fear. It says, you are far too fearful of demons. Now, some of the modern translations are really quite pathetic in their translation. The NIV reads, I see that in every place you are very religious. No, you're superstitious. Superstition is a fear of demons. And people do all kinds of funny things because they're filled with that fear. So Paul is rebuking them. He's certainly not complimenting them for their religious practices. Now, an interesting thing happened. If you can look this up on the internet, around 430 BC, this is a providential event. God organized this. Around 430 BC, there was a major plague in the city of Athens. And many people were dying. In fact, in the end, a quarter of the population died of whatever it was. They don't know what it was. There are various theories. But it's fascinating because what they did was they reasoned we must have upset one of the gods. So up here on this Table Mountain on the Acropolis, they offered sacrifices to the various gods in the various temples there, and the plague kept going. Oh dear, what's wrong? And so somebody came up with the suggestion, some wise man came up with the suggestion, there must be another god that you've missed out on. And you need to construct an altar to this unknown god and offer sacrifices to the unknown god, and hopefully that'll do the trick. And so they carried out the advice, and do you know what happened? The plague stopped. God allowed this to happen, organized this. This was a divine provision and preparation for the people of Athens. So we have here in verse 23, the apostle went around the city. He was very observant. He was watching. In fact, he did a bit of research into the culture, as we'll see in a moment. He says, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Of course, we realize that there really is only enough space in creation for one God. You can't have loads of gods, because they would interfere with each other's realm. In fact, I believe with good reason that the gods, supposed gods of the Greeks, are actually derived from the mighty men that were produced by the interaction, the union of demons and female humans, recorded back in the book of Genesis. Mighty men. So we have men were produced with supernatural powers, with tremendous abilities. And of course they had to be killed off, because that injected the human race with a vast amount of evil. But the mythology, the memory, the accounts of those somehow has gotten into mythology. And I believe that's the derivation of the accounts that you'll read of Greek mythology. Anyway, the word unknown God is literally agnostos theos, from which we get the word agnostic. Gnostic is the word for knowing, remember. And in Greek, when you put an A, it means no knowing or not knowing. So there are people out there you'll meet, and some of them will say, well, I'm an atheist. Atheist comes from a and theos, no God. Okay, it comes from the Greek. A lot of our language comes from the Greek. So an agnostic is an agnostic, someone who says, I don't know if there's a God there, which is probably a better position than the atheist position, because the atheist position is very dogmatic, says there is no God, which of course is a position of great arrogance. Why is it a position of great arrogance? Because here is a puny man, a puny human being, making a declaration that they know everything. That's the bottom line. That they are asserting that within their knowledge, there's no God. How do they not know? How do they know that outside of their knowledge, there isn't a God out there? I mean, how much of the knowledge that is available to us do you actually possess? Only a tiny fraction. You might specialize in a certain area. You might be studying or have studied a certain area, but that is just a drop in the ocean compared to the vast amount of knowledge that is available of how things work, etc. And the more man learns, the more he realizes, the more he needs to learn. There's just depth there. So it is absolutely presumptuous and prideful for a person to declare there's no God. How do they know? Because there's a vastness of knowledge and experience out there they just don't know about. So a more honest position is the agnostic. But anyway, to the unknown God. So here is a stroke of, I believe, inspired genius in the Apostle Paul. He says in verse 23, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. You see, man has no idea about the true God apart from the Bible. Right? No idea. So people out there can dream up a God of their own fancy and their own imagination, but it won't be accurate unless it's based on God revealing himself. God has revealed himself. So the Apostle Paul, verse 24, look at your verse there. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. The pagan gods literally lived in temples. Most of these great big buildings, when you go inside, there would be a great big statue of their god in there. There are some temples in the Far East, and you go inside and there's a great giant statue of Buddha. Who's Buddha? Well, you've seen those statues of Buddha around. It's a rather slightly somewhat overweight man sitting on the ground cross-legged. That's Buddha. Buddha is this man who supposedly, this is Gnosticism, pure Gnosticism, climbed up the ladder and finally reached enlightenment, knowledge, the final knowledge. So he's worshipped as a god. He's worshipped as God. So anyway, these temples had big statues in there, supposedly of their gods. He says, the Lord of heaven and earth does not dwell in temples made with hands. Neither, verse 25, is worship with men's hands as though he needed anything. We were in Burma, and I've got pictures, and people are bringing food offerings and drink offerings. And who is on the statue? Well, it's Buddha, isn't it? So the true God doesn't need those. He doesn't need food and drink, as though he needed anything. Seeing if he giveth to all life and breath and all things, the true God is the source of all life. You know what? Living material has never come from non-living. That's one of the big problems with evolution. Where did life come from? Because life requires a lot of information. Your body and every other living thing requires a vast amount of information. All those plants out there, what tells them to grow certain leaves? Those beautiful flowers, what tells them to do these beautiful colors? And all the intricacy involved in the animal creation. Absolutely amazing. It says in verse 25, he giveth to all life and breath and all things. Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. Open your Bible to Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. Speaking of Christ, it says, for by him were all things created, that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. So even the angelic realm and even the demonic realm, that's what the thrones and principalities are about. All things were created by him and for him. All of this creation was made by the Lord Jesus Christ. You're made by him and you're made for him. Are you giving back to him what he requires, what he made you for? And he is before all things. He's number one. And by him all things consist. He deserves to be number one. So we're down to verse 20, Acts 17. Let me go back there. And verse 26. And hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth. So we have here, of course, it's an echo of what we read from Peter. And in chapter 10, he says, God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. So there's only one race, the human race. He's determined the times beforehand. Kingdoms, empires have risen and fallen. The great empire of Egypt, the pharaohs, gone into the dust. The great empires of Babylon and Nineveh and Cyrus the Great and the Chinese dynasties and all these come and go. God has set their boundaries. He determines. And the bounds of their habitation, when the sons of Noah spread out in different directions, he directed the way they would go. He sovereignly led the different people to different places. Verse 27, that they might or should seek the Lord. What's the purpose of life on earth? Is it hedonism? To have a good time? To grab all the pleasures that you can? That's the philosophy of most people. That philosophy even has been embraced by Christians. That's a demonic philosophy. Your purpose here is to get to know your Creator, to serve Him. And that is the only way you're going to find true purpose and fulfillment and happiness and satisfaction. Everything else results in unhappiness and dissatisfaction and hopelessness. That they should seek the Lord. The purpose of life on earth is to give people an opportunity to get to know their God. And God is striving with people. God is, maybe you're aware that He's striving with you. In the book of Genesis, God said, my spirit shall not always strive with men. The Spirit of God is striving, is seeking to bring men to Himself. He is speaking to them through the creation. How utterly ridiculous for someone to look at the creation to say, this is just an accident. It has design, it has purpose, it has ingenuity. There's a Creator screaming, shouting at people. The heavens declare the glory of God. Verse 27, if happily they might feel after Him and find Him. God is seeking for them. God is speaking. And of course, if people want accurate information, they've got to get to know His Word. We have general revelation in the creation. We have particular detailed revelation in the Word of God. Verse 27, though He be not far from every one of us. God isn't far away. If God seems far away, do you know what's getting in the way? Do you know what gets in the way? Sin. Only sin. Only sin gets in the way. Only sin makes God seem far away. Proverbs 5 tells us, for the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and He ponders all His goings. He's pondering, He's watching, He's observing your doings. He's interested. Proverbs 15, verse 3 says, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. People can imagine, nobody's watching, I can do what I like. Oh yes, for all these things God will bring man into an account. There's a reckoning coming. There's a day of accounting coming. There's a day of judgment coming. He's not far from every one of us. He's only a prayer away. And there's one prayer that God guarantees to hear. You know what that is? Romans 10:13. Might be familiar to most of you. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. He's only a call away. How then shall they call on Him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in Him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? People need to hear the message. And if they reject the message, you know what? They will be reminded of that one day. They'll be reminded of the opportunities they had to receive the Savior. The Bible tells us that today is the day to be saved because not one of us can have any guarantee of future opportunities. We only know of present opportunities. He's not far from every one of us. He's not far from you. He cares about you. He loves you. He desires to bring you into an eternal relationship. He desires that you will call upon Him. His Spirit strives with men, but that will not go on forever. God will eventually give up. God will finish. And the shutters will come down forever. And there will be no more opportunity for man and people to be saved. Today is the day of salvation. Use it well. Use it wisely.